Welcome to the last episode in 2024 of Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities and gender equality. Now, regular listeners will notice that we began with some different music today, and this is because today's episode is focusing on male voice community choirs.
Yes, and you'll know that in our last episode we had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Angelica Ferrara about her research on male friendship and the emotion work that women do to support men. So we thought it would be good to follow that up with a discussion to explore an activity where men get together with other men and support each other in the process. And of course, with Christmas on our doorsteps as well, we thought you might appreciate a bit of a special episode with some music, and we're going to put links to that so you can listen more in the show notes.
We're talking today to Dom Stichbury, who's a choir director, a singer, songwriter, arranger, and group singing advocate. He's the founder and artistic director of London groups Chaps Choir and Bellow Fellows, and he's one half of vocal duo Ben and Dom, who do shows and run workshops around the UK. He also performs with the fabulous Spooky Men's Chorale, which my Oxford-based community choir, the best sing since sliced bread, has had the great honour of singing with on a couple of occasions earlier this year.
Yes, and the piece you just heard beginning the podcast is called Alilo, which is a traditional Georgian sacred song meaning Alleluia, which is often sung at Christmas, so very timely. And this recording by Chaps Choir was taken at the Union Chapel in London just 9 months after they formed. So hi Dom, and thank you so much for being with us and for being willing to share your experiences and your beautiful music with us today.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here with you both.
Thank you. Perhaps to start off with, could you tell us a little bit more about Chaps Choir and Bellow Fellows? Why did you start these choirs? How easy was it to recruit men to join? How are they composed, and how have they developed over time?
Well, I started community singing leading about 15 years ago, and when I started I was leading some mixed voice community choirs in London, and I think at the time I was in my early 30s and I was curious about my own demographic. Although I had done a lot of music over my life and singing as I was a kid, I was curious about men of my age, basically, and we are one of the least seen demographics, not the only, but we are one of the least seen demographics who turn up to community singing, turn up to these group singing experiences. So it was really a provocation. I suddenly thought maybe this could be a project. There could be a project where I could try and leverage the benefits of group singing, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about, and try and encourage more younger men to come into these singing spaces. And I think the adjacent thing to that was there was a lot of talk at the time, about 10 years ago, about men's mental health and about also sort of unhelpful ways that we may live, which might exacerbate those mental health issues. And so these things kind of swilled together and made me very curious about starting a group that could attract younger guys into a singing choir. I think Chaps was the initial inspiration, really, and it was a playful marketing attempt, Chaps Choir, to try and find some guys in London who would want to come and join what I call a male singing gang, which wouldn't look the same as maybe a traditional male voice choir. It would sing different songs, its presentation would be different, and I suppose the message and meaning that would come through the songs would also be different as well.
And is this part of a wider phenomenon, would you say? Does it seem like the number of kind of male voice community choirs is growing at all? Or?
Well, it's an interesting question because we have an amazing tradition of male voice singing in this land, across the whole of our country, including Wales and some in Scotland as well. The male voice choirs that came up out of communities, particularly working communities and places where people had a distinct kind of regional identity, and they'd want to join their local male voice choir. And these choirs are actually struggling greatly to recruit because their membership is growing old, and they're not there are sort of lots of variations within those groups, but generally they might sing songs, of the more traditional or sort of are part of a particular canon of music. And some of that may not appeal to younger men, for example. And then, so you've got that side of things. And then actually about 10, I would say maybe 10 years ago, there's been a very small community of groups, which I call male voice community choirs, Chaps and Bellow Fellows as part of that, which have actually been developed and have grown up a little bit. It's still a subculture, I would say, but this has existed, you know, as the general wave of community singing has also been increasing, particularly in the UK.
And there are other examples internationally, aren't there? I mentioned Spooky Men's Chorale, which you're part of, but I also noticed when I look at your CV, I can't resist mentioning this. Chaps, the Finnish shouting men's choir.
Oh, Hootajat, yes,
Hootajat.
Yeah. Yes, which are a very curious group, and actually they don't really sing; they just shout, as the name, the name suggests. But I think what you're pointing to is a kind of novel, innovative look at maybe sort of male groups and how they present into the arts and performing space, you know, and often playing on. Maybe subverting or even hyping up, you know, what it means for men to be together and how they might present. I mean, Hootajat, you know, I suppose leans into a very, what we might say, strong masculine sound because they're shouting, you know, and but also they shout about some very interesting, important political issues, right. You know, and so there is that sort of reinvention, and Spooky Men's Chorale is part of that too, a sort of subversion of I suppose some traditional masculinities and an attempt to poke fun sometimes, but also not shy away from the complexity.
I guess there is a difference in that some of these choirs we're talking about now are not sort of open access in the way that community choirs are. You know, I mean, going back to what Stephen mentioned at the start, I wondered how you recruited guys to come to your choirs.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we're talking there about more performing groups that I suppose are you know, offering a model to the outside world. But you know, for the approach really for Chaps was trying to find a playful way that might bring some guys into this group who wouldn't normally be attracted maybe to your, I don't know, it's not a nice word to say but average community choir or choral society. And so marketing, as we know, because of our own identities and the ways that we feel about taking part in certain things, is an important part of trying to get people in the door. And I would say that in a way that's most of what it is. So I came up with a poster with a sort of playful image, and I suggested some of the songs that we might be singing, which I think repertoire is very important as well. And you know, I tried to pitch it, and actually we had over 50 guys come along to the first night of recruitment, and I think that was a sign actually that men to some extent are sort of were being underserved slightly by singing experiences, maybe for whatever reason, and there are very complex, large reasons. As you know, connected to a lot of the issues around kind of identity as to why men might not come to a choir. So therefore you sort of have to do that extra work to bring them into that space. So it felt like there was a latent desire, you know, all these guys turned up, and it felt like something about it being in a male group gave permission. And I'm sure this is nothing new when you're trying to attract a underrepresented group into one area. You sort of create a container, you create a space, and you give them permission. So we had 50 guys come along, and then when Chaps started, you know, lots of interest. We had a waiting list of over 100 at one point of guys who are interested in joining. So it just basically said that men are interested in making music, and also they're curious about coming together. It did feel like there was an element, they're curious about coming together in this, what I'd call slightly alternative community, male space.
Do you feel that has the composition changed over time in terms of the kinds of guys who are turning up?
I think it has. I think that we've had some, there's about probably a third, maybe more, maybe up to half who were there when the choir first started. I think that with certain projects, it's not just typical of choirs, but when something's new and novel, you actually attract a slightly different crowd as to when something has a reputation and it sort of is established and goes on. So I think that we had, I would say, a slightly different group of people who first started, and they were trying it out. You know, they were like, what is this? I'm curious about singing together. I'm curious about this community. And for some of those people, it may not have been the right thing, or they might just got what they wanted from it. They've tasted it, you know, which is part of being in a community choir. You know, not the tenure of people is very mixed, and it's that's part of the sort of beauty of choirs as well, that you can come in and out to some extent. But yeah, I think that the composition has changed somewhat. I think one early indication that this was an interesting group, or I was interested in it at least, and a friend of mine who's a researcher became interested, was that this was a mix of gay and straight men, and people of different sexualities in one space who identified as male, and that felt different and unique. As someone who grew up in the 90s and sort of lad mag culture, you know, and had to sort of navigate some of that, it felt like a interesting space, because there weren't people hiding, I think, in those terms of those identities. People were out, they were quite expressive, and actually we documented what some of the gay guys in the group and the straight guys sort of felt about this, you know, and it was interesting to hear from them.
What would you say are some of the things that men get out of being in kind of community choirs like Chaps Choir, Bellow Fellows? Like, is there something distinctive for them? And because you mentioned earlier that there are, you know, potentially health and well-being benefits, for example.
Yeah, so you know, the benefits of being in a choir are quite well documented now, and people saying how brilliant it is for people's mental health, this coming together in a community. There's something very powerful about being in a space and making sound together, which is very counter to how we go about our lives normally in our society. It's very highly expressive, and it's also a way of really being seen by other people. And what I really, I suppose, I mean, is heard and seen, you know, in an expressive state. And I think these things are quite potent for anyone, for many people who turn up to choirs. What I'm interested in, obviously, is this sort of intersection of why it's, like you're saying, why is it important for men? And I think a lot of the guys from Chaps reported that this was unique because these aren't spaces that they're normally in, or that they're used to being in. And so it was very potent for them, because suddenly they're around other men, and suddenly they were singing songs about love or singing songs about loneliness, and it was that the words were being put in their mouth, you know, which were very potent and powerful for them. So there was something about the expressiveness that they were able to have, I think, that was an important thing. I think just general friendship. A lot of guys coming, you know, in who were experiencing loneliness, and maybe you know, also some who have moved to London. You know, London's a very much, obviously, a very real melting pot, and so some guys were coming to make connections as well, for friendship. I think that some guys were surprised, you know, at the how much they needed this space. So yeah, it really, you know, like choirs for all people, it ticks lots of boxes, and there's nothing unique about that. But there are some things which I think are interesting about men and singing in particular. And maybe I'll just illustrate that with one point, is that we did this research where there were some focus groups where Emily Falconer, who at the time was at Westminster University, did these focus groups with the choir, and one thing they were reporting is really how this space is not a competitive space, and it's a space that they felt different to, or less competitive anyway, you know. And this felt very unique to them, and in a way it enabled them to sort of put a different hat on, you know, take off that hat that they often were in at work, feeling like they couldn't flinch. One of them reported, you know, but this is a space where this wasn't occurring. So yeah, to illustrate that, a lot of guys felt like it wasn't a competitive space, or was less competitive as a lot of the spaces that they were in before. And there's something about how to succeed in a choir, and to succeed in a choir isn't to jostle and to try and be at the front. You actually have to, two things have to occur. If you're someone who is often trying to step out into the front, you have to learn to step back, you know, and blend and be part of the whole. And if you're someone who's actually quite timid, and this is the other interesting part of it, it's not just about bringing people back and trying to tell them to blend. It's actually about trying to get those men or people who might feel a bit timid to step forward and actually take their place, you know. And so these are sort of two angles really, which I think are important for some men in this space to learn how to do that. And I would say that it's a challenge. There's a challenge for some guys to step back and it's a challenge for some to step forward. And this is an interesting thing for them. And one of the guys said that he was fascinated by Chaps Choir when he joined because he was reflecting on his sports team. He was like, in sport, we have to win against another team to succeed, to win. But in Chaps Choir, actually, there's no success. That's not what success looks like, you know. So it was a bit of for him, it was a moment of realization.
I was wondering whether there's something also about how men who are in choirs like this become sort of more attuned to their bodies and to their emotions. Is that part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well? You know, Sandy, from singing that singing is is a physical. Our body is the instrument. It's a totally physical activity, and there are stereotypes which hold true possibly about men not being in touch with their bodies and not paying so much attention to them. And when we do a choir session, we always begin with some preparation, and that might be taking some deep breaths, trying to just bring our perception out of our sort of outward thinking mode into our internal mode, sort of working out how we're feeling inside. And of course, this is a route to also getting into feelings. And so there's a lot of guys who who probably don't show up to choir actually, or ever come into the room, who would find that very tricky, because you're essentially asking yourself to go inside, and then we work on the body and we do warm-ups. But I think you can't separate these things out. You're singing, even if you're singing words that aren't your own, lyrics of a song by someone else, this sound that's moving through you, it touches parts of you which are a bit unconscious, I would say, which can kind of move, and like the calcified parts of us, it can kind of chip away at.
Yeah, I mean, I really can identify with that myself. I was just thinking by comparison, if you look at things like yoga groups, very, very few men join yoga. And there is something about the body and movement and emotion, and which I think a lot of guys are not as connected as perhaps they could be, in many ways. So I think that's just interesting, really. But I was also thinking about what else can go on in groups of men. There tends to be a sort of a humour, a banter, a fun element, and I wonder whether that's different in male voice choir from a more mixed choir, because I'm actually in a mixed choir, and there are some guys in there who are also in man choir, which is another Oxford-based male voice choir, and they say that the atmosphere is different, and I'm just wondering if that's the case in your experience as well. But is that hard to pin down? I don't know.
It's hard. It's a bit of a gnarly thing to talk about, I think. Well, I think that it definitely is different. Absolutely is different. It's hard to pin down. It's also different between male groups as well. And I think that says a lot about who's leading, who's come into the group, maybe because of what the group does, what the group stands for, and how it approaches things. But there definitely is a different flavour. And I would say that humour and banter, if as a word to use as well, is part of it. I think I would say that there's usually there's a sort of easefulness that comes with that kind of humour, not being too earnest or taking things too seriously, which probably helps the proceedings, helps people feel relaxed. And I mean, that exists in mixed choirs as well. There's certainly a flavour which might be hard to pin down. There's a flavour for the groups I run, but yeah, it's a tricky one, but there certainly are some things.
I mean, that actually, one thing that comes to my mind is, do you ever have issues in terms of like enabling it to be a kind of an accessible, safe, comfortable space for everyone. How do you juggle that? Because obviously, as somebody who's often felt uncomfortable in groups of men, with things like, I can be quite earnest, and I maybe do feel uncomfortable sometimes with things like banter and is there ever a risk that competitiveness does still come to the surface? Like, how do you deal with those kind of,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you've really hit something on the head there, because banter is, or humor in a group isn't always accessible, like you're saying, for everyone, or comfortable, and it depends obviously what the humor is and where it's coming from. So obviously there's lots of different flavors of that. And I suppose, just to clarify, when we're talking about banter, this is not maybe what you might call locker room banter. This is actually often quite endearing, gentle humor, and I suppose I quite like, as a leader, to try and draw it out and to offer it, I suppose, as a style, as how people can interact in the space. I don't always get it right, and there's a line sometimes, but I think that it and also just says nothing wrong with earnestness. I mean, I'm very earnest sometimes as a leader, and I suppose that it's about how I as a leader kind of go balance that, in front of the group. But I think it's a good point, because I think there are some guys who come into the space and suddenly there are men around them who are sort of calling things out without unprompted, in a slightly undisciplined way, and you can see that for some guys that's uncomfortable. Maybe they're worried about what's going to be said, or is it going to be directed at them. It is complicated, and I would say, on the accessibility point, just to draw that zoom out a bit, is that no choir is 100% accessible. I mean, Chaps, because of its name, its playful marketing, that's not going to appeal to some guys. Some people might be repelled by that and think, well, I'm not a chap. I mean, it's also interesting, these man choir, bloke fest, all these other things, the different identifiers around these words that can mean so much. So it would be disingenuous for me to claim that Bellow Fellows or Chaps is inclusive, because we sort of, you set your stall up, and you try and make it inclusive, but it essentially is something. Do you know what I mean? It has its things that some people will be attracted to or not attracted to, and that includes what happens in the space. It includes how I lead, how I bring people in. It's a really interesting point, generally thinking about accessibility for singing, for other spaces as well.
And you've been encouraging people to sing together in a range of different settings, village halls, offices, schools, festivals, even prisons. How have you found that experience? How does it work to try and run a choir in a men's prison? And what have some of the challenges been of working in these different settings?
So I ran a pretty regular group in Maidstone Prison for about 4 or 5 years, and a similar reaction from the men who took part in that, around using music, using their voice as an expressive agent. A similar reaction. They were really into it, but also I would say attendance was very low generally, and so there's also, it's not the thing that people do. It may be some fear around taking part in this activity as well. Not as much as you might think, actually. That is not the main issue, I think. But for the prison setting, I think men are looking for something to do. Residents of prisons are looking for things to do to try and take their mind off the situation they're in. And so those who came along and who stuck with it were really keen to do it. It was a huge outlet for some of them, So and there's a lot of good work being done with singing in prisons. I mean, across the country, it's a very potent thing. But it's just that the prison system is tricky to obviously do things in, And so having a regular choir meet every week, where you have your choir members come and meet, is practically a difficult thing to do. And there's something about the regularity of the choir, and maybe, Sandy, this is something you can attest to, that it's not like a one-off project. There's something about the regularity of attendance, building up of the connections within the group, which is really key to what this means to people. And actually in a prison, that is a challenge. So often in prisons you have one-off projects, rather than ongoing groups. But as that's an aside really, but a lot of the men who who end up in the room singing and doing it, you know, they get a huge amount out of it, and it's very important to them.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back a stage, actually, because you mentioned earlier about how many men wanted to come to your choirs and so on and so forth. And I was wondering, you know, why are there often more women than men in community choirs generally? You know, why is it that men don't join choirs as much? I mean, usually you're kind of struggling to get tenor voices and sometimes bass as well, whereas altos, you know, there's usually many more of those, because those are largely speaking female voices, you know. So, you know, what's going on there? Is it about gender and masculinity issues, or is it about, you know, boys and education and worrying about presenting themselves publicly, or, you know, what's going on there?
I
do you think
it's a bit like you were talking about yoga as well, you know, and just sort of to zoom out a bit, talking about these things that men don't show up at as much as women, you know, and obviously there's huge. I do think there are masculinity, gender issues that sort of encase that. I don't think it's the only thing. It's the intersection of like someone's personality, their own psychological and their own experiences in their life with other things, and which gender is one of them, you know. So the reason why some men don't turn up to some choirs will be different to why other men don't turn up to other choirs, you know. But if that makes sense. But I think it's hard to pin down. But what does seem to be true is that sort of, unfortunately for mixed voice choirs, what does seem to be true, and it's a bit of it's I suppose a indication as to what's going on, is that when you set up a space that's for men only singing, you have, you know, 4 or 5 more times men in that group than you would in a mixed voice choir. And so I suppose there are then a list of things that leads on, you know, and we did do a bit of very unscientific qualitative research with Bellow Fellows to try and understand, you know, why they turned up at Bellow Fellows and why maybe they haven't sung before, or if they have sung in a mixed voice choir, why they came to Bellow Fellows. And I think there are lots of little things that could be talked about. One of them is often repertoire. So basses and tenors will often get stuck on a part that might just be a do or a supporting anchoring part, and that is, as you know, Sandy, maybe. But, you know, that is the case for arrangements in male voice choirs as well. But I think what happens is that you're sort of, unfortunately, your part is typecast a bit, and you often, you know, don't get to sing a melody maybe, or, you know, there's a restriction really for your participation. I think that's one thing. I think if we're saying that a lot of men, it's harder to get them into a singing space. So if we're saying that there's more of a barrier for their entry, then if you walk into a singing space and you're a man and you see the room and it's 80% women and there's a small amount of men, that might be another indication that this space isn't for you, or that you're going to be a bit unsafe here. And when I say safe, I'm talking about the risk of expression and of the things that we know a lot of men find difficult. So the safety is actually of men all being together, for some men, you know, is going to be a thing where they feel like this is a space where I have permission to actually do this. And as you can tell by what I'm bringing up, there's a huge amount of complexity there, you know, around walking into this space or that space and feeling safe here or not feeling safe there. So I don't know if that answers anything or touches on it.
Yeah, but no, I think it's obviously a very difficult question, but you know, I was just thinking by extension, this doesn't relate straightforwardly, but you know, men go along to football games and sing, you know, in large numbers with each other. I mean, okay, they're not singing anything particularly complicated. They're you know, able to hide in the crowd and all this stuff, but you know, the notion that men don't really sing
totally
is not
and
true.
Well, I think this is a very interesting example. I think you're totally right. And actually, often at football chants, men are pitching their voices quite high, and actually they're often occupying a part of their voice that sometimes it's hard to get men to do, because a lot of men assume they might be a lower voice, and this is kind of strange phenomena. A lot of men assume their basses, not all. If they've done a bit of singing, they won't, but it's sort of, they present as, well, I'm a man, so I'm a low voice, you know, and therefore I'm the lower voice. But yeah, in football, yeah, exactly. Men are, you know, shouting out. I suppose there's a bit of tribalism there. I think the songs are fun, they're cheeky, that I wouldn't say they're very tender, and I think this is one. I mean, I don't mean to sound facetious, but the one thing
true.
that when Chaps first started, one of the first songs we learnt was a song called "The Book of Love" by the Magnetic Fields, and it became a bit of a calling card for us, and the guys loved it. And the reason was because it's a slightly silly, funny love song that also contains some very vulnerable, tender lyrics. So it's these two characters, I guess, that are encased in the lyrics. But what a couple of guys reported in their first few sessions is that they welled up. They got very emotional and they weren't expecting that to happen. And I think the opportunity to have a choir, obviously, as opposed to maybe that using your voice in that way on the terrace, or even being a dum 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 in a mixed voice choir, is that you might be more likely to sing a melody of the lyrics of this tender, vulnerable meaning of the song. So there's a different singing and voice use there.
It's interesting. I was just thinking about because I have been to quite a few football matches, and at the piece we mentioned before by Emily Faulkner, she talks about how singing at football matches, it's like such an embodied experience, that you can really feel the voices. And actually, what you were talking about, the Finnish men's choir, it's interesting because I lived in Finland for a few years and went to some football matches, and the singing at the Finnish matches was not like anything I've experienced before. Like, they would really shout, and in this very well organised way. And there is something quite amazingly kind of because it's the spontaneity of it as well. There is something quite creative about it. About some of the chants, but at the same time, I guess it is quite aggressive, and so it's nice that men are finding other ways to sing in perhaps more harmonious ways as well. But.
Yeah, but you know what? And actually, just that leads on brilliantly, Steve, because I think one thing that I've personally always like wanted to do with Chaps and Bellow fellows and other singing experiences is to not just focus on one expression. So obviously, like football chants are in a very specific context, but the power at which Huutajat, the Finnish shouting men's choir, the power that they transmit that hits your body sonically is incredible, and we need that fire and power as well. And actually, in Chaps, I'm a bit more of the melancholy sort of love song situation. So I have to really dig deep, and I find it challenging. But I want to find songs that are fiery, that bring out the passion and fire in the men who are singing them. Otherwise we sort of just like end up a watery mess on the floor. I think that's what actually is great about choir singing generally, is that any choir, and a good mix of repertoire, you turn up to an evening, you sing a beautiful tender love song which kind of warms that part of you, and then maybe at the end, in the last 15 minutes, you sing something really fiery, like the Alilo, some of the Georgian music. It can be like that too. So I think that broad expression is important. So we explore the different expressions, particularly for men. I think it's good.
I can really attest to what you're saying there, Dom, because I've been to one of the Singing in the Shed events where men come together from around the country to sing, and they don't necessarily know each other. Some of them do over time, but we did a song called, I think it was called "Give a Man a Home," which you probably know, and it was just very powerful, really. And as you said, puddle on the floor time, really, because there was tears in the room, I would say, as a result of that, because we know that homelessness is a huge issue in this country. It affects women too, but predominantly men, perhaps. And it really spoke to something for the guys who were there, I think. So that was one end of the continuum you're talking about.
Actually, you've touched on something else, Sandy, which I think is really important, that it's about men communing together to see each other experiencing the emotions around certain issues. So I think that we might, if we took the stereotypes a bit too literally and without too much examination, we might think that men are unemotional. We might think that men don't have thoughts or feelings about it if we sort of took things at face value. I know that we know that's not true, but the important thing is that men witness each other in a communal space reacting in that way to the material, because then it just gives extra permission for you to go deeper into your feelings. You're like, no, actually this is something I feel very passionate about, or that I can feel the part of me that is connected to this. And obviously this is about gender, this podcast, and this is, a lot of these things are very universal. It's not just about men, but I do think there's an extra juice there for when singing in the shed or Bloke Fest, when guys come together and they sing something so tender, or they sing a song that's slightly political or has a cause, a bit like you're talking about, Sandy. And that witnessing, I think, is a key part of the whole equation.
I think that showing of vulnerability really,
Exactly.
is important. And an expression.
Exactly.
So we've just played another Chaps choir piece written by you, Dom, called Now Is Time. And I believe this is actually about masculinity. Could you tell us a bit more about that, about the kind of meaning you had intended behind it?
It was a song that was just trying to think about another world, I suppose, or tease out the idea of another world, maybe, where we're not so couched in our fears around how we present, and how we are in the world. And I think the song, the chorus is "Now is time." Also, it's a bit of a call to action, saying, now's time to look at these things and to consider them in a new light.
Interesting. Yeah, do you think that, I suppose we've talked about how group singing can be really a therapeutic experience for individuals. Do you think it is something which can actually potentially help to promote, progressive gender relations, shifts in masculinity more broadly, or do you think that's too ambitious, for an activity like this?
I think, everyone sort of wants to change the world, don't they? But I think. I think we live in a culture and a world of mostly subtle nudges and then occasional watershed moments, but I think that there's lots of subtle nudging that goes on and I think I don't think it's huge culture shifting stuff. I think it's subculture, but I think it has tendrils. I know that all I can say is that I know that the participants of many of the participants of Chaps and Bellow Fellows, and let's just broaden this out for a moment as well, and just say singing general. I know that the people who come to choir are often very thankful. It can be a life-changing experience for them coming to a community. And I suppose that when I started Chaps and I had this really interesting mix of men in the space, there was a part of me that completely probably in an over-the-top way thought, oh my god, wow, this is new, this is different, I wonder what's going to happen with this, because the makeup of the group felt special. Felt the conversations were new for the generation of men that were in that space. And I suppose I didn't think it would cause any lasting changes to gender relations, because we're a tiny cog in a series of cogs. But I think that what I've come to learn as a community leader is that you're just working with those people who are in the room with you, first of all, and you're trying to sort of help them navigate this space and express themselves, and you're offering something to them that hopefully they can take from it. And I do know that a lot of the men who have come into the space have felt a sense of, maybe softening is the wrong word, but maybe it's exactly the right word, I don't know. But I suppose it shaves your edges off a little bit when you're part of a community. You do have to integrate, you do have to find a way to get along and to be there. And I think for a lot of the guys who come, this has been a new experience. Many guys have never sung in a choir as an adult, so their last singing experience is when they're at school. And this is quite typical for choirs generally, as adults reevaluate what they were told when they were young, about whether they could sing or not, so they kind of come to choir later on. So I think there is something there, yeah.
Earlier on in our conversation, Dom, you said that the choirs you have quite often have straight men and gay men alongside in them, and that they may have different perspectives. And I'd be interested if there was anything more on that. But also, I wonder whether singing in a choir can be seen as a more sort of middle class activity. Is this the kind of thing that working class guys are getting involved in? How could one broaden it if that's not happening?
I think that it's really important conversation to have, because we're talking about a pretty, I suppose, narrow demographic already. Like, just sort of mean as to the sorts of people, sorts of guys that are going to turn up to this choir, and it is a very middle class activity. It's also a very white activity, and I have colleagues that are doing amazing, important work in trying to engage other demographics and communities. People of colour, for example, or from other parts of our society who don't come and sing regularly, and usually it requires setting up a space particularly for those demographics to bring them even just close to the edge of what this sort of slightly homogenized centre looks like. So I think we have had a few guys. I would say the other thing that interested me about the group is that when we had this group together, we had lawyers, high flying corporate lawyers, rubbing shoulders with part-time gardeners, rubbing shoulders with poets who were struggling to make ends meet, rubbing shoulders with classroom teachers, and so there were intersections even within this slightly homogenized area that did create difference that felt unusual. There's a lot of work to do to bring a lot more people into singing, generally. But I suppose that something about the makeup of Chaps Choir initially was, even within that homogenized middle, you start to see these differences which you're not so used to seeing, shoulders being rubbed in that way against next to each other. So one guy was talking about the space and its mix of sexualities in the group, and I'll just read a couple of sentences from the focus group that he was talking about. But he was saying how he doesn't feel comfortable in the usual heterosexual spaces, around men. And he says that if it weren't for being able to have a giggle about how ridiculous heterosexual male space is, and I probably wouldn't have stayed. But he felt like the space, we weren't trying to be that older space, maybe, or the more traditional space. And then he says, and actually a few weeks later, one of the straight guys came up to me, and I came out to him, and he started asking me questions, and it felt a little bit uncomfortable. And I was like, goodness me, because he realised that he might have been the first gay person that this straight man had met, which is unusual I think in a melting pot like London. But the interesting thing about Chaps is that I found when it first started, this was 2013, and I do think that things have changed quite a lot over the last 10 years in how we rub up against each other. But a lot of gay men in the group were talking about safety, and how they felt in this space, and they felt safe, or at least the majority of them felt safe in this mixed straight gay space. And then I suppose I was interested in also that a lot of the straight men, knowing sort of when I grew up and how attitudes were and how people felt, and all this internalized homophobia that exists, that a lot of the straight men weren't worried about standing up and performing to a group of people and being misidentified as gay, because actually a lot of people assumed we were a gay choir, because in the first couple of gigs I don't know why exactly, just because we're men singing. I think that's it. We're younger men singing, or we were younger men singing. And we were sort of maybe dressed sometimes a bit funny or a bit camp, or I don't know, we were expressing ourselves through our dress in our own way, and there was an assumption about our sexuality. So I think the interesting thing for me is that at least the majority of the gay men felt safe, or safe enough in this space, and the straight men didn't mind being misidentified. And that felt like an interesting thing to me.
No, that's really fascinating, isn't it? One of the things I think, just coming back to your point about the different occupations that people hold. In the choir I'm in, I hardly consider whether what someone's job is. Quite a few people are retired, but it somehow doesn't come up, and I think it's perhaps to do with the fact that we're unified around this activity, and we're into that. And so whether someone is a high-flying law or not is actually irrelevant. And sometimes it's really helpful, I think, for men to leave behind their breadwinner status, which is so central to masculine identity still, I think, and just be, and I think that's a real attraction for me for being in the choir. But it's a mixed choir, so I also feel that with the women in the choir as well, that I'm not so bothered about what they do in their working lives, so.
And I think that the experience of singing together, it negates the need to know everyone's biographies, and because you're not putting people in those, you're not in a situation where you're necessarily wanting to or putting people in those pigeonholes. The experience of singing together, you actually get to know people in a different way than you wouldn't ordinarily, and I suppose possibly in a deeper way, in some way. The thing I was saying earlier about being seen and being witnessed as singing is that when you see someone singing, it can be a very vulnerable thing, which I think is why a lot of men might shy away from it, an emotionally vulnerable thing. So when you're in a group, it really doesn't matter so much what that person does or what their life biography is. You've seen them express themselves, and you've seen a part of them that you wouldn't normally.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing to say is that within the choir, there will be friendships that will develop outside, and you as choir leader probably won't know what the sort of ripple effects of those people being in the choir are, and some of those might be very significant as well, helping each other through difficult times in their lives and so on and so forth. So
absolutely, and I know that a lot of guys in the groups in Bellow Fellows and Chaps, that they've had an incredible amount of support at difficult times in their life, from being part of the group. And I think that speaks to this longitudinal regularity that a community like a choir can give. If it exists for a decade or more, you can get to know people a lot across the course of your life, where you're going to experience those big life events that you might need some help with, or help celebrating with, as we've sung at people's weddings.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does make me think about our previous episode and the fact that perhaps we've seen in recent decades, like the loss of kind of spaces, community spaces where like a range of different people can come together from just different backgrounds, and actually the background is kind of irrelevant, and connect. And I think that's so needed, isn't it?
Yeah, I my sort of pet theory is that I think one of the reasons why choirs are so popular is obviously the music making is the main thing, and what we're talking about, the expressing of using one's voice. But I think there's this real need for exactly what you say, Steve, for sort of disparate people to come together around the community you live or from nearby, and you meet people who just you're not just stuck in your home, and this feels almost radical in our culture, with maybe organized religion not having its, compared to 100 years ago, not having the status it has. I think it's key.
I was just amused that Philip Reed, who leads the choir that I'm in, he has this man choir, and they did a song called True Colours during COVID, and it was interesting, partly for the song, because it kind of played to the situation that we were all in, and what was it bringing out in all of us, but also that you got snapshots on a video of the men's domestic lives, and so there was a whole mixture of stuff as a background video, which was, some people were in their workshops tapping away, others were washing up and ironing, one person was on the roof, this sort of thing. It was quite remarkable, and as I say, you got this insight into their domestic lives during COVID, which was
I saw that. That was very fun.
It was fun,
I saw
wasn't
that
it?
video.
Maybe we
very
can put
good.
a link to that as well.
We did one with Bellow Fellows. It was Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, and we just did a short little version of it, and I think the instruction was for the Bellow Fellows to just hold something. It was very pet related, so to hold an animal or something that they liked, good. Or and it was just a little way to kind of see something about their lives, which was nice. But those, and as you know, Sally, those kind of virtual choir projects, as we called them, which weren't live, obviously these were constructed, were also a fun, playful way for something for the groups to do whilst we were locked down, to take part in. And And just on the vocal element of that, I think for some people, singing on when you're on your own on Zoom, you might be used to singing in a choir, and suddenly you're confronted with your voice on your own. And I think that was challenging for some people, or you had to record your voice, And I think that was a new, for a lot of people, you're in a group. You're in a room singing together, and the reason you're turning up is to sing with other people, and then suddenly you're sitting at home, and that's a very different experience, and so you sort of encounter your voice in a different way. And for some people that was fine, but I think for others it was tricky, because people have negative views often about their own singing voice, which kind of obviously why a lot of people don't turn up to choir.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Dom, if you don't mind sharing, is how you first got involved in singing and then eventually leading choirs, because your passion is really kind of infectious. So what was your own kind of journey into this, I suppose?
I was lucky at primary school to have a really great music teacher who did a lot of communal singing, and in fact I've just been in touch with her recently, Miss Innes. And then when I went to secondary school, and similar thing, my music teacher there was brilliant, and the choir in both of those settings in a way was the sort of centerpiece, because the range of repertoire that we sung was really appealing as a young budding musician, and so choir and singing together and being together with others, I don't know, it solidified really, and it became a really important thing. And so when I turned to music later on as a career, I did study it at university, and I sort of didn't go into it immediately, but again at university I was singing in choirs, and it's something about coming together that felt very important. So when I came back to music, leading choirs and being involved in that activity felt really important, because I knew how I wanted a place to go, where others were communing and where I could sing with them. And so this communal experience of music making and of using one's voice for expression was key really to my musical development, and not just that, I would say to help me in my life at those moments. And so this was the thread really, and I suppose then that led into fed into my work as a practitioner myself. And I would the other things I would say is that my own experience with mental health sort of started to, the penny dropped when I realized how important I didn't realize at the time how important those spaces were until I started becoming a practitioner myself. But then the other sort of added element of looking at male identity, which I became very interested in as a younger man initially, because I was curious about whether there were some of those things that were being not very helpful to me into how I was interacting with others and how I was in the world. And so that fed into my interest in also Chaps choir and creating that gendered space, to gently explore those issues. So those things did come out of my own machinations, my own experience and struggles I suppose I was having as a younger man. It sort of fed out of that.
Perhaps to end the podcast, we might play another Chaps choir piece called Drop of Shanty, which is a comedy shanty, which I suppose also shows some of the more humorous side of some of these choirs as well. Thank you so much for giving your time to speak to us. I mean, what you're doing is, it's really kind of inspiring, and as I said, your passion is really, there to see, and the music you're creating is wonderful, and it's clearly having a really positive impact on people. So and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Best of luck with the future projects.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Yeah. Well, that was a really lovely conversation with Dom, Sandy. Perhaps could you tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in singing in the choir as well? I'd be really interested to hear
Glad
about
you asked me that, Stephen. But actually my routine has been a bit different in that I got into this through protests, demonstrations, and the way that happened for me was I went to a workshop run by a guy called Stephen Taberner, who actually leads the Spooky Men's Chorale. And it was just at the sort of high point of some of the Extinction Rebellion activities in London. And, he did this workshop. We learned some songs. And then we did flash mobs outside King's Cross Station, outside National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, outside Westminster Abbey, and then I was hooked by that, really. And later on, I joined the choir that I'm now a member of, which isn't particularly focused on politics or anything like that, but that was the route in, actually.
That's fascinating. Have you found it has had a positive effects on you of the kind we described? Because I do think there is a lot to say there, isn't there? And I think there's quite a lot of research which shows in all sorts of ways the positive impacts of singing and being part of a choir. Even in your body, boosting your immune system. My partner taught me about how singing exercises your vagus nerve, which is really good for your well-being.
Definitely, there is something about just the whole experience and what it feels like to be in a choir. And I'm talking about being in a mixed choir, but I think some of the effects are going to be similar, and how I experience them, certainly. The sense of listening to others, harmonising with others, being connected with others, bonding, all of these things are quite significant in the experience, I think. And also just, feeling a certain sense of equality about it, really. That you're less bothered about whether someone, what someone does in their life, but you do feel that you are involved in creating something together, shall we say, and that's significant and very moving at times as well. And definitely when Dom was talking about particular songs, like Give a Man a Home, but how one guy had said that this really felt significant to him, that he did feel alone but didn't in this setting. All of that I think is very powerful.
Absolutely. I loved what he said about the fact that, in lots of ways, being part of a choir is quite antithetical to this sense of competitiveness, which, we as men perhaps learn that we have to kind of live up to a lot of the time when it comes to these masculine expectations, that you have to kind of learn to take a bit of a step back and let your ego take a bit of a rest. But on the other hand, also, perhaps for those men who might be a bit more shy and timid, there is also an element where you do also have to learn to step forward and project your voice. And so that's probably something for everyone to learn.
Definitely. And we mentioned some of these sort of equalities issues around choirs, which are interesting too, around gay, straight men or race. Actually, another thing that occurs to me, which we didn't really talk about, is age. And one of the really nice things about being in a choir is the intergenerational element, depending on the composition of the choir. So I've got to know people who are in my choir who have kids who went to the same school that mine did, but they're 20 years later on, and so there are lovely sort of correspondences that you can have as a result, and I think being aware of where people are at different points in their life is something that can arise in a choir.
Yeah, which can't help but reflect on, how we perceive, how gender is connected to voice, and how we perceive different voices, and how, for boys, there is this whole phenomenon of like boys' choirs within the Christian church, for example, and how boys' voices are seen as uniquely kind of innocent and pure and angelic, and then suddenly that's all gone, when your voice drops. That's quite fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, and I was also thinking about I was thinking back to our episode with Richard Bliss, actually, and the range of different ways that art and creative activities can be used perhaps as a way of like engaging with boys and men as well about issues of gender and masculinity. And I wonder if there are any examples out there of actually how people have tried to use singing as a way of trying to, encourage boys and men to reflect on issues of emotion and vulnerability, for example.
Well, I can see from what Dom was saying, how powerful it would be in a prison setting,
Absolutely.
For example.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that, he couldn't get more men involved in the prison where he did work. But I know, having worked in the prison system too, that actually, making activities happen, it can be difficult just because of locking, unlocking, schedules, staffing. It's all of that stuff. We discussed this with Dan Boyden, didn't we, on a previous episode. So it'd be nice to think that there could be activities around singing outside the prison setting as well for those who are involved in offending.
Absolutely, yeah, where issues of loneliness and isolation and alienation can be particularly significant. Yeah. But I think that's probably enough for today, isn't it, Sandy? Unless you want to end with a song yourself.
Oh, don't tempt me, Stephen. Well, the one we used to sing, and probably still is being sung, was the low voices went, "Cole, don't dig it, don't dig it, don't dig it," and then the high voices went, "Leave it in the ground and learn to get with it," something like that.
That's brilliant.
Very amusing.
That's lovely. I think that's brilliant, and of course a very important message. So
yes, which we will return to.
Absolutely. But for now, we should probably stop and wish you all a very happy holidays, happy Christmas, and we'll be back with you with more episodes in the new year.
Yep, happy Christmas, happy New Year before the time. But
absolutely.
Yes.
And thank you as always for listening to us. Do leave a review as well if you get a chance on your podcast app, because that does help to share the podcast more widely. And subscribe if you haven't done so already. Share us with your friends and colleagues. Do contact us at nowamen@gmail.com if you have any questions or feedback. And take care of yourselves.
Bye for now.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Bye.